this event is anyways a special event that we have a distinguished panel and focusing with words from Partha Bhattacharyya, but this is in some ways linked to ongoing work on the future of coal in India, which is a large multi-year study that's in its final stages, really looking at what's real, what's the future possibilities, because some of you, if you believe newspaper reports, would just say coal is dead, renewables have taken over the world. But I think most of us in this room have a sense that that's not either true or not so easy, and not overnight by any stretch. And so a large number of reports. There was one a few weeks ago on transportation and coal, railways and coal. We have copies outside, and these are all publicly available on our website. It really emphasizes the fact that your price delivered of coal isn't contingent entirely on CIL, but it's actually levies, the taxes and cesses and surcharge, as well as transportation costs that actually are far higher than what CIL receives for the coal. So that is actually the dominant factor in looking at price trends, which then of course propagate into end users paying for it. So this study is public. We have one on supply and demand, where these are under final peer review, so should be out shortly. One sort of emphasizing how what used to be somewhere in the order of 6.5% growth of coal, if you look at a previous decade, is going to fall in the next 12 years, looking at 2030 horizon, to in the order of 4%, plus or minus on a number of assumptions. So it's not as if coal is dead, not any stretch, but the growth rate of coal is coming down, thank you, markedly. And so what does that mean for supply chain and requirements? There's another piece, in fact, one paper is out on RE, renewable energy and coal, which really talks about the lack of a crossover. It's not so simple, is another one. There's another piece on the political economy of coal coming out, and then several more, including works by some of the folks in this room, in fact, are contributing to this volume. So that's over the next few weeks and months. So please keep your eyes peeled. King Coal is still alive. If I could request our distinguished panelists to please join me, and then we could get started, sir. So thank you everyone for joining. We're delighted to have a very distinguished panel, and for those of you who have not seen it, this is a must read, because it combines sort of what has happened and more with the lens what can happen. That there are success stories that need to be not only shared and heralded, but also lessons drawn from it. And that's in fact one of the intentions of this discussion, is not just to rest on the laurels, but also look ahead, whether it's the finance fiscal point of view or the institutional stakeholders point of view. So we're delighted, former CMD, the person who really was one key responsible actor for the IPO process, but there were a number of other stakeholders who really helped from the government side and ministry side, number of players. The formal book launch has already occurred. The reviews are there on Amazon, and I believe it's the top-selling or a top-selling book on Amazon. So I won't describe the book or attempt to summarize it or give a cliff notes. But it really comes back to this question that when we talk of what is the future of coal in India, we cannot do it without asking what is the future of Coal India as well. Because Coal India is not only 83-ish% of the production of coal in India, it's the single largest coal producer in the world right now. And somewhere in the order of 78% owned by the government of India, somewhere approximately 78.34%. And so there is strong governmental links to not just policy, but actual production. We also have with us Mr. Sumit Bose, who was the finance secretary in the government of India, recently retired, and was involved, of course, with the IPO, the roadshow, and many aspects of Coal India. We look forward to his remarks on this. He is currently vice chairman of NIPFP, amongst other hats that he continues to wear. We also have Mr. Alok Perti, who has been a coal secretary in Government of India, as well as served in a number of departments, including health, transport, and was also member secretary of the Kelkar Committee, Government of India. And so thank you for joining us, sir. And man who needs no introduction, but I will still emphasize, Partha is now not just a scholar, he works with a number of companies as well, but he's also a mentor to scholars, not just at Brookings, but in other institutions as well, giving us academics a real-world reality check, I would like to think. So please point us out when we're completely wrong, which happens a lot. So the way I thought we'd start is open it up to just a few opening remarks, then there's a set of questions, and then we'll open it up for discussion. But Partha, if you could just share some sort of insights, lessons, and also in your mind any questions that remain, because this is a journey, it's not a tick mark and we're done. It's an ongoing process of transformation. The energy sector and Coal India both are undergoing transformations, coal and energy. So some remarks there.
So thank you, Rahul, and thanks to Brookings for actually organizing this kind of a debate. I must also share that at least 2 of the chapters which I subsequently added, which I had no intention of adding. I'm quite a bad writer. I get bored to death when I have to require to write. But when Penguin said that you must say something about the future of coal and future of policy and all that, I had to fall back upon whatever I was getting from the interactions with Brookings, and some of your work tacitly or in some form is already there, has gone into that, particularly the railway study and all that. Some points I picked up from that, so that has made the contents a little more contemporary and richer. First of all, thank you so much, sir, for joining all the seniors here. Mr. Vishnu, of course, is our batchmate. Balakrishnan Saab, my senior, and he was secretary coal at that time. Sajdev Saab, very senior. Your name has been mentioned in the book in some context. So, and thanks to everybody. Mr. Rohatgi, you have been also during our time, you were a CMD of EIL. And thanks to everybody. I don't know everybody. Mr. Dasgupta I just met sometime back, member CA. And thank you, thank you so much. Now just let me first of all mention a few words about why this book. Because, well, there has been, Coal India has been going on for about 40 years now. And no need was really felt for somebody to write this kind of a book. But what I felt the need for is the following. See, Coal India has undergone a massive transformation during 4 decades. It has transformed from being a highly loss-making company. Mr. Sajdev is aware of those days. In the first 2 decades after formation, it used to remain a loss-making company. And from there, it has moved to become one of the most profitable tax and dividend-paying public sector enterprises, ultimately becoming a Maharatna company. So the journey by itself is a very exciting story. I have had opportunity to look at the whole thing very closely, most of the time, and during some part I had the opportunity to be in the driver's seat. So I have always felt very good about sharing this journey with students or participants in this IIM Calcutta programs and these things like that. And the response always used to be spontaneously very good. The most important thing is this was the story that was told to the global investors in some form, that see the consistency of the management process in the company, how the management has, how the company has evolved, and what the management has done consistently to move in that direction. And let me share with you, this story was really accepted with a lot of spontaneity, and I would say the response was not anything short of being electrifying. They were absolutely, it was akin to something like a standing ovation. And Mr. Bose is aware of what kind of response the IPO fetched. It's quite unusual for a public sector. First of all, a public sector. Second of all, coal. It doesn't have great stories to tell. Not known for great reasons prior to the IPO. At the time of the IPO, it had to be known. But it was a challenge. Let me share that initially when we were the only unlisted Navaratna. Because at the time of giving Navaratna, a debate was that it is not given to anybody which is not listed. So listing first and then Navaratna. But we had to share at that time, the demand supply gap was staring quite largely, and the capability of project approvals faster comes with Navaratna. So therefore, we advised the government that you may consider giving Navaratna because that will speed up project approval processes. And government considered that. Quite not very usual, but they did it. Ruling all kind of negative observations. They did it, but gave a rider that within 3 years you have to list yourself or otherwise get back to us for a review. So which means that the status could be potentially withdrawn. So that is when we took the task seriously. We were not sure that what this kind of thing is to get ourselves listed. One thing was made very clear that because it's a large IPO, global investors' perception is going to be very critical. And when we talked to the global investors in our various visits abroad, the initial remarks were quite scary. We were sort of accused of being inefficient. We were told that you bugger up land. You are one of the large landowners in the country who don't care about land restoration, reclamation and things like that, and several such allegations. I'll not go into the long list. But the issue is certain specific things were told. The perception was not very positive, it was negative. So we took that very seriously. And what we did was, for every point that was mentioned, we created a response. And response not only in terms of word by word or rather speaking, but in terms of doing certain things on the ground, which made gradually a big difference. I'll just narrate one of that, which is very relevant and is relevant even today. There was one allegation of land being sort of buggered up and restoration reclamation not being done properly. When after that, when I came back and spoke to the CMDs that this is what is the general perception, so they said nothing, sir. Aisa kuch nahi hai. You can just come and see and visit and all that. So whenever I visited, I found that okay, it is reasonably okay, but not really to that standard. Not really the standard which I find in Australian mines or other mines where land is restored to normalcy. It's not really like that. But something is done. But then I tried to look at the KRAs, the key result areas of the project officers in open cast mines. And I didn't find any number or any weightage for doing reclamation restoration properly. So I thought that there is some problem. So we advised the companies that this must be number 2 in terms of weightage. Very high weightage should be put next to coal production, and this must be in the KRA. But not stopping at that, we used GIS. We took images of all major open cast mines, annual images, and by comparison, we could see whether the restoration reclamation is commensurate or not. It was very, very easy and very clear. And this message had gone down to the project officers also. And in this kind of a situation, you see a company like Coal India, you will find it absolutely compliant. So 53 mines became compliant. They contributed 85% to the open cast production, and all of them got ISO 14001. This was a great story which we could write in the red herring prospectus, and this silenced the critics very largely. So similar stories are there for so many other accusations. Basically, we took this seriously and responded to each one of these. So the responses were there available for them to see. And then, of course, the story of from losses to profits to super profits was quite exciting. So they found it really exciting and the response was great. Now the IPO was absolutely the best. I mean, this has been the largest IPO so far in India, and it was one of the top 3 in the world in that year. But not many people know about what made the IPO so big or so great. So that was when I felt the need to actually bring the story out of the carpet and share it with public at large. These are the conditions under which a PSU based out of the eastern region of the country, specifically Calcutta, can actually do something which is very, very remarkable. So that is the reason for writing this. And the other point I have already made actually, that I was thinking of stopping at that. But then because of some some sort of pressure from from Penguin and from the ideas that I got from Brookings, I thought of adding a couple of more things as to what is the road forward for coal, what could be, and where coal can go, and what kind of policy framework will actually enable those things to happen. So that's all about the book. And
Thank you. Mr. Bose, you've seen this from a finance point of view as well as overall government. We keep hearing that, well, in Coal India's case, there is slight divestment needed, I believe, to comply with the Companies Act. But is there a plan or appetite or need to go further? Or is this comfortably going to be a 75% government-owned entity? And how does that matter for the output? So in fact, we'll also come to you, Perti, on just, the future isn't just the financial side, but the physical side. The output is really key. If you look at power plants, I mean, they're the ones who are sort of looking at, can Coal India meet this need of the country? So first, I'll request you to just share some thoughts, both about the history and general processes. You could maybe share some thoughts. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Congratulate Partha on this great book and Brookings for holding this event here. I was Secretary Disinvestment at that point of time when this IPO happened, and by far it was our major achievement as a department during that time. And thanks to the entire team here, Bala, Alok, Partha, and of course all those who worked from Department of Disinvestment in making this a success. But I'll just tell you a little anecdote about how much of it gave some of us a rock star status around that time. It's usual for a Secretary to Government of India being treated as a state guest when one visits another state. So we, as Secretary Disinvestment, one had to go to Bombay from time to time, Mumbai, because, well, all the action is there from the financial world. So normally you are received by one of those protocol officers. They are there around the clock. I mean, they have shift duties, and you are escorted to a car which they give, and you drive off. And similarly, while coming back, they usually take you to the plane. Once I found about 8 of them hanging around. This was just after Coal India had been listed. I was very surprised. I said, what's happened? So they work in shifts of 2. Then apparently, they started asking me, we made a lot of money in Coal India. Now tell us what is your next thing coming and what should we buy? so persons who are not on that shift, they had specifically made an effort to come and talk to me because they wanted tips. Of course, the tip I gave them, sell some, keep some. About the sell some later, or keep it as a sort of a blue chip thing. Unfortunately, there has been disappointment of that. Perhaps we can talk about that later during the course of the conversation. But the IPO really changed a whole lot of perceptions about the disinvestment process in general and about PSUs at that point of time. Some of it, the promises were not fulfilled. I mean, that promise that there could be large-scale reform of PSUs as general, I'm not talking about, it was not. But we could see the spillover in other smaller companies getting listed. I recall, for example, we listed after Coal India, this small company based in Nagpur. We talked about Eastern India, Nagpur, Moil. No one knew Moil. State governments also, Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh had shares in it. So I asked them, do you want to sell? I told the finance secretaries, you will make some money at no risk. Because all the processes we'll do, you'll make some 200 crores each or 200, 300 crores. It will help your budget, I'm sure. And so they readily agreed and we listed that. And it was a roaring success. Only because it followed from after Coal India. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So I think it created a whole perception about the disinvestment process, a positive perception of the disinvestment process, as well as how PSUs could perform, or the promise of performance post-listing, and as some research had shown that even partial disinvestment can improve governance, Some of that has happened, some of that has not happened maybe. But at that point of time, this is what happened, and I think that's the direction we have to move. Well, I think during the next round I'll come to where Partha has left some things not fully stated, or where he has stated some things. I feel he has inadvertently also pointed out to governance lapses, not on CIL's account alone. These are governance lapses of Government of India. So all of us are party to that. But this, the IPO itself was, and something, we tried out everything new, the method of selection of bankers, everything for this. And it, of course, all that we were able to also put down. There's a handbook for disinvestment which we created after this. It's still on the disinvestment department's website. So we could do a whole lot of things. After a long time, this was the first listing, for example, to take place on BSE. You see, if you recall, some those of you who've seen this, the growth of the stock exchanges, BSE fell into very bad times over the 70s. There's the Bombay Stock Exchange. So government and the financial institutions, they put together the new stock exchange, which was the NSE, which is now, of course, the leading stock exchange. But so much so that the government files, at least in Department of Disinvestment, showed NSE to be a government-promoted organization, which was it not. I now recall reading all this about ILNFS. It's a bit of a deja vu in the sense that you read about the same sort of things, that the public perception of something which is actually that's government, which is not. Of course, there were very good reasons to promote NSE, but I had to overrule that and get this listed at BSE because we wanted to give both the stock exchange, as far as we were concerned, we were neutral. We wanted to give both. So a whole lot of new things happened with the IPO. I will come back to some of the other reforms that I am talking about at your next round.
Yeah, Mr. Balakrishnan, who was the secretary with us at that time. Mr. Sumit Bose was secretary of disinvestment. And others, Partha, who's written the book. Well, I was there during the launch of the book, and I did speak a little bit there, and I wonder whether I should repeat all that. A lot of it has been said by Mr. Partha Bhattacharyya and Mr. Sumit Bose. One can say that it was an exercise which we well remember, and experiences which are quite fascinating, whether it was dealing with the department when it came to the choice of bankers, whether it was dealing with the company, writing the red herring prospectus, or going around in the road shows trying to explain things at times which were very difficult to explain, particularly a few issues which he mentioned about land, and perhaps you did mention one of the most difficult, and I think it stared us right into our face, was to explain why there are so many cases of vigilance and why we still carry on in a company and do good work. It was a trying time to explain all that. Well, I think the point that you made is that there was a journey which Coal India went through up to maybe the IPO. Post-IPO, Mr. Balakrishnan left the ministry very soon after the IPO. I think it was 2011 that you left. I think this was December 2010, and the IPO took 2010. November 2010. Mr. Partha Bhattacharyya left or retired from his post in February 2011. 2011 saw a very bad time when it comes to coal. two reasons. One was a perception regarding environment and the terms that became very popular both in the media as well as in our government writings was something called the go and no go, of which the author himself was Mr. Partha Bhattacharyya. But that concept not being fully maybe appreciated, but more being kind of interpreted the way the Ministry of Environment talked about it and the way the media talked about it, it put a virtual stop to new projects being cleared. Added to that was an unusual rain that took place in that year. It reduced the production significantly. In fact, there was no, I think 430 million tons of coal was produced in 2009-10 and 431 was produced in 11-12. A very difficult time. I remember having taken charge from Mr. Balakrishnan 1st of September that year. Running around, it was a lot of time spent in Jharkhand, in Chhattisgarh, and I think West Bengal, and basically trying to meet the state government people, meet so many others. It was a little bit of a difficult, but by December one did see a bit of revival. The other difficult part of it was that after Mr. Partha Bhattacharyya left in February, we did not have a regular CMD in the company for more than a year. I think Mr. Jha was in charge. He was Director Technical in charge, but the regular CMD, this gentleman from Andhra, CCC, Narsingh Rao, joined in April, at the end of April 2012. We were going through a very difficult time, and one of the things that I remember having done, which was a very unusual thing, was to use the Articles of Association of the company to give a formal direction to certain things from government, which is a very unusual thing. But then, as Mr. B.K. Chaturvedi, who was ex-cabinet secretary and at that time advisor energy, remarked one day in a small little group where we were sitting, is that the independent directors of the company have already declared their own independence, and they don't seem to be listening to what the company wants to do. It was a very difficult time. Subsequently, when Mr. Narasimha Rao joined, there was a slight amount of revival. At that very time, some concepts were being talked about as to how do you reform, not the sector, but even the company. What kind of reform should be brought into the company? People talked about the example of the State Bank, how the State Bank is structured, whether you could have a holding company of that nature and you could have the subsidiaries in that way. An exercise was done in the government at that time. I think IIM Bangalore was engaged to see whether there can be a restructuring of the company. It didn't result in any. But then government got involved was pushed to see whether the auctioning of the coal blocks could be done. In 2013, an attempt was made at auctioning of coal blocks, which failed. You can cite many reasons for it. But then what was happening was that the production was increasing, coming back to 3%. I think that year it was 3.5 or 4% increase. And then the new government came in 2014. And everybody probably is aware what happened thereafter. The Supreme Court ruling on the PIL cancelled all the blocks. And I think it was a bit of a, one would put it in mildly say, a kind of a shock for the whole sector. I don't think we have even got over with that shock till date. And I think we are getting deeper and deeper into the crisis. One of the things which my friend Rahul said was that apart from the cost of the coal at the mine head, there are so many additives that makes the whole business quite different. And if government or the country is looking at competition, is looking at providing feedstock for steel or cement or for production of power, then basic feedstock must be cheap. Otherwise, you are basically raising the prices of these, and as an intermediary, it is bound to be passed on to the consumer. Whether it's 400 rupees cess, or whether you have 1.1 rupee 70 paisa per ton per kilometer as tariff, real tariff. Any of these, it's going to be passed on to the consumer. It's not going to be paid by the coal company, and it is not going to be paid by the power plant, it's not going to be paid by the steel company. Steel may be a little different because you look at market, but why I say power is that today the biggest power company in India, NTPC, has very cleverly, I would say, if we go back to 2005 and 2006, 2005 the government came out with a regulation, the Power Ministry, that henceforth all power will be sold through a bidding system, through competition. But then they gave 1 year leverage to the public sector, that 5-year leverage, 2006 to 2011, that they can still have PPAs which would be on a cost plus basis, MOU basis. It would be basically assessing it would be a cost plus basis. The result was that NTPC probably signed the maximum amount of PPAs during that period, and the coal discoms were in a fix. If you look at that background, then you can go on increasing the tariff, you can go on increasing the taxes, but ultimately it's me and you who use this power will pay for it. And the person who's going to use it for manufacturing, it's going to hit his pocket harder. So when we are looking at a competitive world, we need to do some thinking out of the box. So we got badly hit in recent times when I would looked at in the steel sector. When the Chinese exports started increasing, we started putting barriers. Whether it was a regular barrier, whether it's specific anti-dumping duty with respect to a specific country, these barriers were being put up. You moved a lot from when Mr. Partha Bhattacharyya left. I think lots and lots of changes are taking place. And we are talking of coal, then we must try to understand that we are making use of coal very, very costly. And at the same time, we are probably trying to partly justify it by saying that we are moving away to renewables, so let us discourage the use of coal. But I personally, I've been talking about this, writing articles and various things. My own feeling is that there is no point in dragging on this and believing that you are going to get away from coal for the next 2 or 3 decades. If you are not going to get away, then what are the answers to these issues? These are some of the thoughts that come. Of course, I don't want to give any solutions at present. Maybe questions arise and we can give some views on it. So this is what I would say. As far as the book is concerned, I did get a chance to see the draft when it was sent to me for giving my observations. I did give a few observations. Some of it has been put into the book. But the lesson to be learnt, I would get back and repeat a little bit of what I said in the last thing is that if you read the book carefully, it gives an impression that even in a public sector, which we all keep on saying is all public sectors are full of inefficiency and so and so and so, a professional approach can make all the difference. This is the kind of message that comes from the book. So this is all I would like to say.
Sorry. So I think we will get back to some of these questions, and we welcome speculation because I don't think we'll be penalized for getting it wrong. And the other thing is, of course, these are hard questions without a simple right or wrong, but there are trade-offs in many of these. And I think that's really the fundamental choice. So, I mean, coming to renewables, for example, at one level they're displacing coal, but they're not necessarily displacing coal capacity, because the output of renewables in the evening peak isn't contributing to the evening demand. And so it's a much more complicated sort of an issue. But certainly policies that are ad hoc or silo based will lead you to distortions and risks down the stream. There were a few set of questions you may have seen with the invite, but like any good professor, you know, the syllabus is meant to be a guide and not a mandatory. But we won't necessarily cover these unless you wish to. But I think this discussion has organically led to 2 or 3 main sort of threads. One relates to sort of what has changed. You look at the stakeholders of CIL, it ranges from employee to the ministry itself, the Ministry of Coal, Ministry of Environment, railways, local and land, and then of course the buyers, the NTPCs of the world, or the
main ministry.
Sorry?
We're messing out the main ministry, Ministry of Finance.
Finance.
The fiscal deficit is met out of coal.
Yes. Finance, and then of course the and then of course the power sector, including the direct buyers. And you have interlinked ecosystem with its own set of distortions in each of these. So if we're attempting to sort of say that I'll fix this little piece, but I'll ignore the rest of it, it's not clear that that can suffice. And second, just in terms of quantums, the financial side aside, like getting coal as low cost is obviously beneficial to the end users, but regardless of cost, so stepping back, CIL is relatively profitable, pays a good dividend, and that margin is there on average. They don't get that from all the locations, all the mines equally, but there is a profitability. And yet on the other side, people are sort of saying, we don't have enough supply. The burden on CIL to produce is very tight, and we are still reliant on significant imports, something in the order of 200 million tons, 150 being, I think, thermal, metallurgical being around 50, roughly. And so where is this gap, or what else is needed? Because classical economics would sort of tell you, well, if something's not being produced enough, raise the price. Well, you don't want to necessarily be doing that, in part because your delivered price is not dependent on the CIL pricing alone, but also because it is profitable. So is lack of pricing or pricing power really what's holding back production? And if not, like I said, finance, the usual, is it financing as opposed to, or what else sort of is really needed? Because there is a need for more coal, at least in the visible sort of a future. And it's open. So these are not directed questions unless, yeah.
No, I don't talk about so much on coal, but let me take off from what Alok left it, saying that this book shows that even in the public sector, a professional approach can make a difference. I think this book also points that, to the fact that the public sector needs major reforms. I think it's never been stated openly anywhere in this book, but let me see. I have flagged 3 instances here. One where Partha talks about how with the then CVC, he could work out on a method to procure tires for dumpers. And that very successfully, and thanks to the support of Mr. Pratyush Sinha, he is one of our very respected CVCs, and he's written a nice epilogue for this book, how he also went out of the way and they could find a solution. That is one instance. My question is it the job of the CMD to spend so much time on solving what is relatively, I mean, it's an issue which should get sorted out without having to really go up all the way to CPC. And that's where I think the underlying, my thought immediately went not to the fact that you succeeded. I'm sorry to say when I read that. That is, yes, it went to what have we done? I mean, we meaning all of us sitting in the government to create a situation where as CMD, this is the time and effort which you have to spend. As CVC, CVC should also be looking at other things. He has to, and his office has to spend so much of time and effort into letting CIL procure tires for dumpers. It's an obvious thing. If you have dumpers, if there's a shortage of tires, you go anywhere and buy it. That is one. Second, there is an instance of which you call standing your ground, where there was only one bidder for this coal production in open cast mines, and went all the way to Committee of Secretaries. Now, what has the Committee of Secretaries? Why should it go to Committee of Secretaries? Where Mr. Balakrishnan, of course, backed CIL and the matter was resolved in this book. But the question is, here is a bid. The company which has called for the bid finds it that financially it's not viable. It's a bit far too high to accept. It rejects it. So be it. The bidder should our courts are open all the time. The doors are open. They should go there. What is it which is leading this company to believe that we will not go to the courts, but we can go to the government and raise this level? I mean, it ended at COS. It may have gone to cabinet also. So what is the structure we are doing? The third is an instance of failure where you have said where you could not create a SPV with less than 51% ownership to create. Now, these are all pointing to the crying need for public sector reforms. You see what we have done. It's all right. I mean, that the president or the government should expect dividends. I think there's nothing wrong. Everyone expects it. Even a private promoter expects dividends. Nothing wrong in that. That the government should be able to give a directive as owner, as 80%, 90% owner in that when this happened in whole India. Fair enough. But what is happening day to day? We have created a structure for normal. We have a Companies Act. SEBI has the LODR, the listing regulations. We have competition law. In all these, why do we have to give exemptions for PSUs? And we have created a series of exemptions, and we have tried to then create something called DPE guidelines. DPE is the Department of Public Enterprises. Their guidelines in order to tackle those same things. The same things where you have given exemptions, you have drawn up guidelines, and through that you are trying to monitor. This is not efficient at all. This is not efficient at all. And some of it is ridiculous. The sort of exemptions which are given. The Companies Act says that while all listed companies, if they are giving unaudited quarterly results, what you call limited review has to be done by the statutory auditor. For some reason, the Companies Act gives exemptions to PSUs, that there it can be any chartered accountant. No PSU has ever used it because it doesn't make sense. They will use only that statutory auditor, but you have created an exemption. So I think the time has come when government seriously needs to review all these exemptions. It doesn't matter. You are appointing the independent directors on the board. You can appoint anyone you want. Put people which the government can trust. Let them run the board. Let them run the company. And that will, I think, enable PSUs to really unlock the values, to create. See, you can't expect all CMDs will be like that. you should not expect.
It's not a scalable solution.
It's not scalable. This sort of effort which have been which have been narrated in the book, are not doable every time. So you must create, and you have 200, 300, you have 150 PSUs, even if we, which have to be run. So you have to create an enabling environment where the average company with an average CMD, average, I'm not necessarily saying that they're not, but a normal CMD, normal condition, you should be able to run the company efficiently. So I think this book, in a way, brings that out without ever saying so. You have never said so, but that is the sort of message which comes out. And maybe at some stage, I would also say that, after 2011, there was a serious challenge. You recall that the TCI, the Children's Investment Fund, in 2012, went to court. I think they filed in high court. There was a serious challenge to the governance. But one thing saved the company more than anything else. That was what was written into the red herring prospectus. Two things were written in. The presidential directive could be given had been written in there. Second, the full disclosure about how pricing is done was made. So I think it comes back to a very professional approach, which I think everyone took at the time of the IPO to ensure that the professional advice we received from lawyers, we did not write roughshod. It seemed at that time, what are we writing? Why are we revealing so much? But all that ultimately helped Coal India. So that is, I think, really what I'm pointing to is that is what governance is about. That is what good governance is about. And that's why these public sector reforms, I think we've got, these are public sector jewels, the companies which are there, and all of them, they could run much more efficiently if we didn't plug for these exemptions. We think that by giving exemptions under Companies Act, under competition law, under LODR, we're doing them a favor. We are actually not.
So in fact, if I could pick up on that before we come back to the earlier sort of questions, if I could rephrase it in the terminology of risk, you look at the power sector, who's bearing risk? Using power as the anchor, because a lot of coal goes for the power sector. Thanks to vigilance, thanks to risks or fears. In fact, coal secretary had used these words, that decisions are guided by the worries about what will be said 5 years later. So then you adopt a low risk attitude, which is almost like business as usual with mild incrementalism. So now the question is, when we're staring at a future 5 or 10 years hence, where higher renewables are just one of many changes and transitions in the energy space using, again, power, it's not clear to me as if incrementalism is enough. Even at the output level, CIL can grow a certain amount, but if you actually say, I want to grow to the level of ending the imports, for example, in a much shorter time frame, it's not clear that incrementalism would be sufficient. So what are the frameworks of governance, of risk? To me, the dual of governance is also risk-taking and who bears the liability or rewards and so forth. I think our entire structures have been set up to avoid, that sort of breaking out, because the downside risks then negate the upside.
First of all, what my friend Sumit Bose said, there is a crying need for reforms. Well, you gave an example as to what was the need for X decision to be brought up to the committee of secretaries or at a higher level. When Mr. Balakrishnan had left, I was having a brief discussion with, at that time, the principal secretary, Mr. Alok Perti, on this issue. He said, what can be done regarding Coal India? I said, you need to reform. Not only that, but you reform the sector. Look at the way. But I said, more importantly, I think you need to understand that these CVCs and the CBIs, etc., should stop looking at public sector undertakings as government departments. They are business entities, and taking risk is a part of their business. Yes, if reasons for taking risks need to be recorded, that's all that you want. But if a company goes in for a loss, you don't hang the CMD. If he's done his job, he says out of fear that he is going to give a contract. He went to the, as you rightly said, why should CMD go to the Chief Vigilance Commissioner and say, I want to follow a procedure like this to buy tires? But but what really is disheartening is that we have actually, since those years, when we come to know what has happening in the government, we have practically moved in the opposite direction. You will remember CMD, sir is there. So there is a committee headed by an additional secretary which looks at linkages, coal linkages in the Ministry of Coal. They only take the recommendations of the user ministries, whether it's say if it's cement, it comes from industry. If it's power, it comes from Ministry of Power. They give you a list that these are the companies that are coming up with projects and they need the coal. And Coal India is there, the railways are there, and a couple of other departments. They sit together and they kind of take a view, okay, a linkage can be given. But the extent, the amount, from which company, from where, is all decided by CIL. And CIL does this in a manner which takes, I think you have a committee of CMDs. It's presided by the CIL CMD. They take a view, okay, X from so much, so much, so and so. There may be some flaws in that, but okay, said and done, that's a part of business and they got to do it. Today when we look at it, these decisions are being taken at the cabinet level. Leave aside decisions at the subsidiary level, these have been lifted up to the cabinet level. And I remember one proposal which was amazing. I never heard of it. A particular proposal was to give linkages to companies which had with the private power producers which had not gone through the competitive route, but they wanted directly to supply to the discoms. A clear no could have been said, but the decision was taken at the cabinet level to say no, not to say yes, but you go to the cabinet to get a no. It's amazing the way we have moved, and look at it from the point of view of the coal blocks. You may disagree with the decisions of the government at that time in terms of who was more suitable or who was not, but there was a process in place, and the very fact that you made 200 allocations, and if you look back, there were really hardly any court cases or any complaints. To have completely wiped them off and blamed everybody for the last 20 years has set the whole thing, stopped the whole process. Today what we have is, if you go back, again, there is to my mind, when I say it in this, I hope no press is there, but but there is a paranoia about, not kind of going through a process of selection, but let everything be decided on competition. There's a kind of, but what the added cost is coming through that. I don't want to get into, people are aware or not, but the process of auctioning itself today has been proved to be a very, very faulty. Government itself has gone and put a committee and saying, let's review the process of auctioning. There's been something wrong in it. Now, it was glaring in your face when you found that you auctioned about 21 or 22 blocks, and today less than 5 are under production. And that also, many of them was want to return it back. That means there's something seriously wrong. And 3 rounds have been attempted where you failed to even sell a single block. We have gone into the idea and we thought that when this happened, okay, a big drastic change takes place. But we could have gone in for commercial mining. We didn't. And I don't think even today we are prepared to go in for commercial mining. We are far from it. Though of course there is a cabinet decision that says that you can, the method has been outlined, but it's been more than 8-9 months because we've taken a step forward. I think I just wanted to add what you were saying is that you're right. One would like to see these kind of reforms in which more autonomy, action, not really in terms of saying that okay, I have delegated powers. Delegated financial powers is fine, but action, like if you don't have a different setup the way you want to look at PSUs from the vigilance angle and other things, you will continue to drag these things up. And what you said, that the coal secretary, I don't know, probably it was Sushila, I don't know who, made this remark. They don't want to find somebody knocking at my door 5 or 10 years hence.
I'll just touch upon the points that has been made. See, in fact, I sometimes curse myself for bringing e-auction in the coal industry, But that was for a completely different purpose, and I never thought that that same e-auction could be used in this manner. When the e-auction of coal blocks started, the initial results were scary. So at that time, since I was a part of the advisory group in the ministry, so I had access to the minister and the secretary through SMS. So I just sent them a SMS saying that the results are very, very scary. And if it is allowed to go on like this, there could be huge problems. Because the prices were just going heavy. The minister responded saying that I'm asking secretary to get back to you. So Mr. Sarup said that nothing else can be done because we have to take care of CEG, CVC, CBI. So let this process roll on wherever it ends. Now, I feel that when we are talking about reforms, I think instead of reform forward, we should even think of reform backward. Because things were not that bad. I tell you in the, let's say in in 2000 or thereabouts. If you see the book, we did 5-year currency swaps with embedded options, which Reliance was not doing at that time. And not one transaction, 100 transactions in a competitive environment, no complaints. Whom did we convince? We didn't have to go to the government. Today I'm quite sure it will definitely involve the PMO. Nobody can decide. But that time it was only the Coal India board. And what was the response of the board? The board, we gave a very proper analysis that the portfolio between dollar and yen exposure should change because of these reasons. And we suggested from 39/61 to 50/50. The board, getting convinced, said that why not 60/40? That was the kind of board. So there was a huge support for everything. And at the right level, which didn't include any cabinet or anything like that. We never thought about cabinets. We did the complex restructuring, capital restructuring in mid-90s. It was basically Mr. Mehrotra and myself. We did it. It was approved by the cabinet. But never was so much of thing. I'm quite sure today these kind of things may be much more difficult than what it used to be in those days. So I think we have really moved retrograde. We need to look at that. Even whatever we were capable of doing earlier, whatever empowerment was there, somewhere that has gone away. Let me give you one example. Why should somebody other than the company decide its production target in a 5-year timeline, 1 billion ton? And what is that 1 billion ton? You don't know which projects are. Does decision like this?
It goes the other way.
It goes the other way. And then you say 1 billion ton and then drop project chart. And if you are saying with that kind of authority, I still remember in one of the bookings workshop, when the 1 billion ton came first, I think I don't know where it was. I don't know. You see, what happened was, just before the minister was coming, I was told to say something. I said, this is neither necessary nor required. And at best, it can go to somewhere around 750 million tons or whereabout by 2020. And that's the maximum that Coal India can do. And if coal is required, you have to go for import or whatever it is. Don't expect Coal India to produce it. They will again be subject to over expectations. That is the problem of the company every time. Now, when the minister came, somebody might have told him that there is a talk going on of 750, 800 being feasible. He said that anybody who says less than 1 million ton is anti-national. Now, and therefore in that kind of a climate, all the subsidiary companies started pulling up figures. And a company like BCCL, which I was the CMD, spoke about 100 million ton. So I mean, see, it will never cost 50, sir. I mean, you know BCCL. And the CMD said 100 million. So everybody wanted to get into that one-upmanship kind of thing. So that is where you completely kill the self-initiation or the self-initiative of the public sector. If that is not done, public sector certainly can deliver far, far better results. And we have shown something, but this is only just, I would say, just a tip in the iceberg. Much more can be done. And they're capable of doing. Only thing is, government has to believe in their capability. That's all. You do one thing, you better verify and trust. But once you trust, don't go back and forth. That is the most important thing that is required.
So, I mean, picking up on these numbers issue, even if you look at, for example, the renewables targets, 175 is officially there. There are discussions of even higher by 2022. And yet, this current year, the solar output is looking like it'll actually not grow nearly as much thanks to safeguard duty and worries that they have. So the answer doesn't seem to be next year we'll just double the targets to play catch up. So one of the things we've sort of written about is instead of the targets per se, it's your frameworks that matter. Once you enable the entities to do, whether it's the RE or the coal developers, once you get the frameworks, which include the issues of finance, risk, offtake, linkages, railways and all of this, then the organic equilibrium could be as high as it needs to be because there's a feedback mechanism. The market or the power, the discoms, like if you look at the power sector, if you just say I need so much coal or so much RE even, and yet there's no off-taker, or if there is an off-taker, it's a displacement, then it's not clear who's left holding the bags, except we do see it. Look at the NPA crisis that people are talking about. The RBI talks of stressed assets. These are mostly thermal power plants, more private sector, no PPA, etc. So if we do want to go to better output, what are the changes or the institutional or the framework improvements? You've mentioned some of them on the governance side, on the targets side and the flexibility side. Any other sort of, yeah, please. Yeah, these are all questions for anybody.
See, basically, if you look at how the sector has moved over this period, that will provide you the answer to this question. Coal India was formed at a certain point in time when the growth rate in coal sector was less than 2% and Coal India was required to increase it to the required rate of somewhere around 5% plus, which it did. From 75 to 91, it went on like that, and that was based on budgetary support. Suddenly, from 91 onwards, the budgetary support was cut out. It was phased out, and Coal India was told to become self-reliant. And in that situation, Coal India found that it cannot anymore get into greenfield projects, virgin coal fields, and things like that. I mean, the situation which allowed, say, Singrauli coal fields or Rajmahal coal fields, etc., to come up was no longer there. So it went in for brownfield expansion more and more. And therefore, blocks were taken out. A study was done at that point in time which revealed that Coal India will not be able to meet the demand of the power sector if the power sector capacity addition accelerates the way it was visualized. Having said that, what happened was the next 15 years, that promised acceleration didn't take place. The power sector capacity addition remained at 40 to 50% of the target, which Coal India was capable of servicing. All that changed in 2007. Because in the 11th five-year plan, the capacity addition was actually trebled, 3 times more than the average that was going on. That writing was not seen in the wall. And what the government decided at that point in time, that was the point in time where commercial mining should have been opened up. Instead of bringing in new players, formidable players, to create a mature market, the simple solution was to thrust everything on Coal India. Coal India will have to meet everybody's demand. That is what was postulated. And the result is what? The result is two things. A, your imports went up from virtually 0 to 150, 60. I'm talking about thermal coal, not. And then in spite of that, stranded assets. So we should have developed a proper coal market by bringing in much more number of multiple formidable players. That is how every country in the world is structured. You look at every other major country which produces coal, be it South Africa, Australia, Indonesia, US. There are multiple players. That kind of a situation should have been brought here. And you can't have a country of the size and complexity of India being serviced by one company. It never happens. And then sometimes you feel like talking, okay, let us break them into 7 companies. That is not going to help, because they are organically one. So the biggest Chinese company, if their share of that company is only 9% or 10% of Chinese requirement, so how can you think that without formidable multiple players, a country of this size can be serviced? So that is the fundamental problem of today's shortage. And this problem will remain if you don't address this. Even now. I mean, even now, there is a legislative change is there, but how much of seriousness is there to bring that into picture? I am not very sure. That is one. The other thing, when you said this solar, see, one factor one has to consider, that any capacity that is created, because this was your classical theory, any capacity that is created should not be allowed to remain idle. Okay, so if you have 30,000-40,000 megawatts of capacity created or getting created over a period of time, allowing it to remain idle is the worst of the things that can happen. So top priority is it should be allowed to function. And whatever is required to be done to provide them that coal should be done. So that requires players. So without doing that, if you are allowing other things to happen, and PLFs of the power stations are allowed to go down to 59 or 60%, whereas it was 79% in 2007-8. And today it is down to 60%, in spite of the fact that better capacities have been created, better quality capacities are available now. And at 60% or 59%, the private capacities that have been created can't service bank loans. So it is, you are creating an NPA problem. And that's again going to go back to the taxpayers, because the banks have to be capitalized. So these problems are all intervened. And one has to, you see, you cannot say that I will 175 gigawatt of solar. Why don't talk about targets? Allow the markets to find out their own targets. That is what should happen. If that happens, then normally market will clear this out. But unfortunately, what market should decide, you are trying to decide administratively. That is the genesis of all the problems that we find.
Now come to the last point you mentioned about the opening of the sector and private competition. Also tell me, today 72% of coal production is coming from so-called MDOs. This is a very cosmetic name given to a contract mining, which is against the law. You know that, I know that, everybody knows, including these two executives sitting here. Now they are about 48 MDOs. They are virtually independent. All Coal India is doing that 72% production, they are collating it like a marketing agent in a sabji mandi, and they are selling it. Now reforms which you are talking, first thing, things must precipitate to the surface. What we are losing? We lost the basic strength which Coal India, technology, absorption strength is totally, in my opinion, I may be wrong, it is zero. Today you are talking of, rightly said about dump trucks. At one point of time we were introducing 270-ton trucks, 40 cubic shovel and all that. I wanted to get in that crusher conveyor technology, which of course Singhani got, Coal India didn't get. Sumit knows when we were trying to work with the World Bank and Germans. As a result, today outsourcing was started when Mr. Vasant Sate was Prime Minister, limited to sweeping, colonies, roads, and some extraneous work like canteens or maybe some supplies, as we can talk of very minor things which have no relation with the production. This went on, and like a Arab and camel story, it is virtually now overrunning the company. Now company now is totally strangulated of its own doing. Whatever board may do, you have external director, you have internal director, you have CMDs, you have secretaries, but who is the managing the industry today? Those 40 odd MDOs. Some are very minuscule, some are giant. And the giant can, you know, I won't like to name anybody. That's one part. And about the competition, this can be converted to good competitive approach, provided you have some set of benchmarks in terms of productivity, production. Now the reverse is going to happen maybe next 6 months or 8 months, when the unions close to the election becomes very strong. They will force you to pay the same wages which Coal India.
They already were asked to
No,
join the
that is
pension.
only on paper.
Pension.
That is only on paper.
Okay.
Only on paper. 100 people are employed, 30 are paid on that, 70 are to share the rest. As we go close towards election, these things are going to bounce on us. This point has never been exposed by any professional within the company. You remember the day you joined, I sent you a letter to increase the production, look at the existing mines. Existing mines have potential which can really go at a low cost, low capital, and extend the life of the mine, because an underground mine reserves never get finished. They only get deeper. So this is one point which needs to be dwelled upon in a very professional manner. Now what has happened in that? Perti knows, and also Bala, that in some of the companies like Mahanadi, cost of coal production is close to about 75 to 80 rupees a ton, which when delivered, it goes 2000 plus. Now you mentioned that so much is coming from surface miner. And the claim is, totally no professional who knows the job, knows the mining will agree. Okay, when I do surface mining, my quality is better. No, only size is better. And whatever the stones get mixed, they become black. And they are indiscernible, they cannot find out. It goes to that point and he has to live with it. In a situation of demand and supply gap continuing, you cannot correct it. You made a promise in IPO that you will wash coal. 19 washery, 110 million ton. Not one thermal coal washery has seen the light of the day. 2 coking coal washeries have been commissioned in March. Sushil Kumar went and did that puja and all that. 50 million tons of coking coal, I repeat, is going to power plants. If you wash it today, we have numbers investigated by SAIL RDCS, CFR, CMP, everybody on the earth. They can produce about 15 to 20 million tons of coking coal, matching the quality of blending with Australian imported coal. We are not looking at it. See, because monopoly is one, cancellation of coal blocks, IPO, all these things culminated into today's situation. Today we are feeling coal is, yes, I'll tell you why. Why? Pricing. Monopoly, IPO, as he mentioned, Sumit mentioned, you mentioned, it's a good check on the governance of a company, no doubt. Because you are being watched by a person who is signing his own check, not only by Shastri one. Then what happens? When you go to the market and monopoly continues to build up, see that one, disadvantage today. I remember that I've seen this Coal India growing. When the sanction power of Coal India was 2 crores, I joined the ministry. Then it went to 5 crores, then 10 crores, then 20 crores, then 50 crores, then 100 and 200 probably. That time I 150. Now I left the scene. So now you have 10,000 crore company. You have, instead of going for this MDO is not wrong, not bad about, but to fix them benchmark. They are using those 2.5 or 2.6 Oaklands and 12-ton trucks. Labor is cheap. And worst thing is happening, which I shouldn't mention here, because many people are sitting who don't come in within the purview. That's not the right thing. You know, I know, and you can't mention the book also that. Thank you.
Just respond to this. The point is, we at no point of time, this was debated very intensely by the management in Coal India when I was there. At no point in time the idea was to cross 50%. Coal plus OB taken together. That was one. Second point, it was a decision taken in the CMD's meet, which was supposed to go to the board and get clarified, that in any particular mine, if we are bringing an MDO, if we would have done the mining departmentally, the kind of equipment that we would have used, that will be the specs for MDO also. He cannot use any different equipment. If it is a 10 cubic meter shovel that we would have used, it should be 10 cubic meter shovel by him also. Somewhere it got diluted. I don't know how it got diluted, where it got diluted, but it did get diluted. After.
Shudder, you know. Tell mining engineer.
Yeah.
We want to use that.
But let me tell you one thing, sir. Once you open up commercial mining, these MDOs will no longer remain MDOs. They would venture into commercial mining. It will happen, sir, because they are now getting 75 rupees.
Give them license or
Yeah, they will. You see, the point is that they are getting 75 rupees, for which they will get now 1,000 rupees.
As you are regularizing unauthorized already in Delhi, give them license of.
No, that shouldn't be the thing, sir.
In a proper structured manner, so that they don't become a leech. Let them leech on the system.
Yeah, that if you have. So I think opening up commercial mining can actually lead to that kind of a situation.
Yeah. All of the
If you could
panelists.
just introduce yourself for the.
Yeah, I'm Daljit Singh. I work for the Center for Energy, Environment and Resources here in Delhi. I work mostly on the power sector, but since coal is so closely connected with the power sector, I'm very interested in what's happening in the coal sector. So all the panelists, all of you have talked about the need for reform, large scale, significant reform. But I wanted to ask you, what is the possibility of that reform happening? If you look at what happened in coal, in a way, the Supreme Court order was a perfect opportunity for the government to rethink what is happening in the coal sector. They could have taken care of what was needed and, immediately, but really taken their time and rethought the whole thing about how the coal sector is to be restructured and gone ahead. But they didn't do that. So, we see the same thing happening in the power sector, where there's a great need for real, well thought out reform, but it's unlikely to happen. So I'm wondering whether there's any it's making me very skeptical about real reform in India in these sectors, because there's no government wants to spend the political capital to do it. For coal, you'll have to deal with the labor unions, you'll have to deal with many things. And so if you could talk about how this might be brought about, what are the chances of something like this happening? Thank you.
So if I could just emphasize.
Add a question to
Sure,
reform
and-
so that it can be answered together.
Sure, and just one more clarification. To paraphrase what Daljit was saying, one theory has been muddling along. We've gotten by with muddling along, but what does it really take to get beyond that muddling along sort of a
Sorry, just add a point here so that the panel can answer the question reforms in a collective fashion. See, you're talking about reforms on the public sector. Basically, you're talking about systemic reforms. I would like to add a dimension on reforms of the people who are on the board of the public sectors. And somebody just said, you have whole-time directors, you have independent directors, you have government nominee directors. I'll illustrate this problem with a real issue that I know of. This particular company was negotiating a contract, which was a large contract, was to run for about 10 or 20 years, a very large contract. And it took several years to negotiate that. and it was put before the board subcommittees and informally had gone to the board also. Some of their suggestions were incorporated, etc. And then finally, the contract was ready to be approved and was put up to the board. And the board approved it. But before the board meeting ended, one of the government nominee directors received a phone call on his mobile to say not to approve this item. And it was not approved. And as per the guidelines, if the finance member, government nominee, and for large financial transactions, he's not agreeing, then there is an issue. With the result, and this direction came from such quarters that nobody is willing to take it. It was hanging fire for 2 years. The company suffered a lot, and finally, somehow it got resolved. So how do you reform such kind of thing? The person who received the call should have said, sorry, it has been approved. So this is also a problem of reform in the public sector.
Is there a follow-on question? No, Shubho, is it a follow-on?
No, wait. But in the commission, I suppose it's all related, but won't take now or won't take later?
If it's all right, we take one or two more together. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Shubhamoy Bhattacharya from Business Standard. My question is, we are talking of reform and opening up of the coal sector. My concern is that assuming an ex-company comes in from abroad as a coal miner, it will be dealing with downstream, its buyers will largely be from the public sector. The transporter will also be a public sector. In that, because it will be railways, the buyers will also be the state electricity boards or the public sector entities. In that sort of a configuration that we have, does it make sense to open up, to consider this sort of a point of opening up, because it might actually end up in more litigations all around, rather than, because who carries the can for disruption in this sort of a environment is my question. I'd rather be more comfortable that we look at building up efficiencies within the system. But that's a question for fun.
Yeah, I had a question. My name is Rohatki. I retired, and I retired as chairman of EIL, and before that, but spent a lot of time in Bharat Petroleum. Was director refineries there. As a contemporary of Partha, when he was the CNM Coal India. So first of all, I must compliment Partha for having written a book. It's not very often that a PSU executive, chief executive, writes a book. So first of all, Partha, compliments for that. And I have not read the book, but what I gather is that it talks about what is ailing public sector. And I think there's the discussions also hovered around what's ailing public sector. So how to remove it has been discussed, I think for very many years, since one's known. But my point would be, like in coal, I was in oil for about 25 years, and the question that used to be asked and we used to deliberate all the time was, what's the future of oil? It's going to end. Are there going to be renewables? Are there going to be electric vehicles? But for the past 20 years, I have seen oil's grown worldwide. It's also grown in India. We are putting up facilities, whether they are import of LNG, which is something much newer, or whether we are putting up refineries. We're going to put up one more very large refinery on the west coast. So we don't see a clear-cut answer, despite the onslaught of renewables or threats of renewables. And how does the coal industry tackle this question? What do they think about the renewables coming in, or the electric vehicles coming in, and things like that? That's my question.
Maybe Dr. Dasgupta could also just share some thoughts on the demand side, being with a CA hat.
No, yeah, as far as demand is concerned, no, we have this electric power survey which we do every 5 years. And the latest survey which we have done had projected a demand of 225 gigawatts by 2022. And if I remember correctly, it's about 298 gigawatts by 27. Now, as already brought up by Dr. Tongia earlier, is that the peak demand will actually come beyond sunset. So we really can't wish away our coal-based plants. They are very much there. The renewables can only help us during the daytime.
In the short run.
In the short run.
Yeah.
Now, I'll just respond to a few observations made earlier that NTPC had signed about 40-50,000 megawatts of PPAs just before the deadline. Now, all those PPAs are actually today in doldrums, in the sense that power is available much cheaper, either at the exchange or because of renewables. So now NTPC is trying to work backwards and see, put up proposals like, pooling of power tariffs or pooling of fixed costs, so that they can kind of make a portfolio of their cheap plants with the expensive plants which will now come up in the future. So all those PPAs are not really, may not actually fructify. I mean, those plants may not actually fructify. But since I work in Central Electricity Authority, I deal with the power sector but not coal sector per se. So I can't talk much about coal, but only one thing from the power sector's point of view is that the coal supply today is of course much less than what is required, in the sense that even today the new plants, whenever they get a FSA, they are only given 75% of their ACQ and not beyond that. They have a different dispensation for pre-2009 plants and post-2009 plants. But the only issue, the big issue is that the FSAs, we've spoken a lot about the profitability of Coal India, is you're a monopoly. The plants are nowhere to go. The FSAs are completely one-sided. Take it or leave it. That's the attitude of the Coal India. So we have to kind of be more balanced and treat this issue more equitably, so as to ultimately it's the consumers who are hit hard. That's all I have to say.
On one side, I would like to mention a small point, which I would request Booking to look at it. Other day, a few months back, before last CA chairman retired, I happened to attend one of the conferences where he was speaking. And CA brings out that demand today, energy availability and demand shortage only 0.6%, 0.4%, 0.2%.
LGBR, load generation balance.
Whatever is
report.
that.
Yeah.
He said very interesting thing and very correct thing. He said, look here, how we worked out demand, we take sigma of the discounts ability to recover money, and that is added on, and that is put as demand. Rest of 30% of the country which they don't get electricity or don't pay for it, they are not taken in the demand. As a result, we feel that electricity shortage in the country is less than 1%. But just to go out of Delhi towards Faridabad or towards Dadri or anywhere, you find half of the day is dark, even night. So this issue has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed a sort of detached manner, not as part of the system, because system has got a norms on which they report the demand. And Ravindra Kumar was very right. He said, we take the sigma, if there are 29 discoms, they give the demand, and we add it on it, and plus minus 0.25% here and there we do it. And the availability is available. All the power plants are giving their availability, and we find it's matching. This fallacy has to be.
Chair, I think very interesting issues have been raised. I think we begin with the issue of NTPC. Why I said that was that in the intervening period, discoms were not coming out with any tenders. One reason was that they were financially in a bad shape, and other reason was exactly this, that they had already tied themselves up with a whole lot of PPAs with NTPC. I think it's a good sign that over a period, this crisis has come up. It had to come up. Let me put it. It had to come up. There was perhaps little leeway that they would have got away. To begin with, the government itself made the mistake by giving such a long handle. Should not have given it. The issue is that the demand is there, and there are various ways of looking at demand. And if one is looking at a connection to every household, then all these methods are not going to get you the right figures. So the issue is that, well, even if you say that the actual demand is maybe 40-50% of what you are projecting, then where do you get the energy from? That leads me to the question as that, okay, you said, somebody said that there is a threat coming from the solar to the coal sector. So what will happen if there is terrific amount of expansion of the solar? Well, you see, technology is moving in many directions. If you look at solar, where are we going? We are trying to reduce the cost of panels. It has come down. We are trying to see whether we can get cheap storage. We are moving in that direction. That would help you. But to what extent it will help you is again a question mark. Whether it's like every, you can say that, okay, you have the requisite storage, but how long? 8 hours, 12 hours? What happens in the rainy day? What happens on the dark day? What happens in today? You have to have a backup. That is not going to get away unless and until some magic comes up on storage. So, coming to that question is, what is the kind of happening? It is being projected as if coal is a source of a lot of pollution. Yes, it is. And because of that, it should be replaced. Well and good. But the point here is that what are we doing regarding reduction of pollution from use of coal? That is another direction in which we are moving. If we look at the efficiencies, like coal-powered power stations today, you can go back to 30% thermal efficiency. But if today we are talking of ultra supercritical, which is looking at efficiencies around 45. So if you are having 50% increase in efficiency, that means you are reducing emission or maybe equal amount of emission. You are not increasing emission, but you are getting more power. So can we then make comparisons as to where solar stands against that? Some people have done it. World Coal Association has brought out several papers on this issue. Second thing is, we are talking of utilization or sequestration. How far does that research really take us? Is it going to be, are we going to have matters maybe 10 years hence, something that becomes commercially viable and doing this activity? Then are we going to wipe off and say, then it will be a matter of comparing whether a consistent power from a coal-fired power station where carbon emissions are being controlled be preferred against solar? All these issues are emerging. Well, we can't shut it off. So when you say a threat, I think we can't take it as a this or that. Everything is emerging. It's just coming up in various ways. So to answer it's a very difficult question, in fact. in the face of what is happening, whether we can expect reforms. And that I won't answer, I'll leave it to my friends Partha, and because who rang up, who said who. In today's world, everybody knows where the phone calls come from, so let's not talk about it. They will answer. But just just to say about today, you see, the point here is that we have been, my senior colleague Mr. Balakrishnan is here, but we've been in government for long, 30 years, 35, 37 years. What we have really been hearing from maybe last 20, 30 years is, and from international agencies, even within the government, delegation of administrative action is the essence of good governance. Today, we are moving just in the opposite direction. I don't think, what you're saying is that, like, we reform certain ways of looking at the public sector, or we have a relook, and at the same time increase delegation of action. We are not doing that. So in the present political environment, what doesn't see a chance, frankly. The issue raised by my friend right at the back, well, any change is painful, let me tell you that. Any change is painful. Because it is painful, let's not do it. Then you'll never give birth to a child. So, I think one has to see, okay, we may, and this is, I must disclose this to you, that when we talked of reforms or restructuring of Coal India, a report came from I think IIM Bangalore or somewhere, or CRISIL, I don't remember who made it. But this is exactly the arguments they gave, not to change. So so I think when we are saying change because the way forward to cut this entire process which is going on, and because of the monopolistic way of looking at things and so, and to give an opportunity to the market, I would say, to bring equalizers. There is no way out. It will be painful. Let's not say that we can. We've tried a lot to internally improve. It doesn't happen. Let's face it. We've been in government for so long. If you tell me that public sector, you leave public sector itself to, well, there may be exceptions like Partha, but there won't be many exceptions at all. So to that extent, I would leave his question to be answered.
We'll let Partha have the last word, so I will. My comments have been limited because we are whole sector experts to public sector reform, the reform of the PSU reform. I still feel that is something which is possible. It is possible even in the present scenario. Whether it can happen in the last part of a government tenure, I don't know. But I'm saying overall that it may not be possible. What are we talking about? We are saying that let the PSUs perform under the same set of laws as what the private sector is performing. Don't make exemptions in either the Companies Act or the LODR of SEBI or competition law. Let them perform. This part I think is eminently doable, because we are not for a moment saying that presidential directive still will not be given or cannot be given.
Can I ask a clarification?
Yes.
We have states who have sued Coal India for being monopolistic under CCI. Government discoms, government entities have sort of sued, and the counter is given, but they're not a monopoly. They may be a de facto monopoly, but legally Coal India is not a monopoly. So then, how do you reconcile, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, talks like a duck?
So what am I saying?
So then what does it really need to get away from the de facto level as well? The reforms, like...
See, first of all, you have to make legal reforms. See, we claim as a country we are good at making legal reforms. So why not make these reforms for PSUs in general? Let's begin with that step. Let's take away the exemptions which we have. Let's and that's not. I mean, it's sector agnostic. It's not only about coal or about oil. It's about general the PSUs. Let's start with that. I think that part is eminently feasible because it's the direction, and I think more and more examples we are seeing where, because otherwise what is happening, anything which has remotely a PSU or PSU-like label, everyone is backing off. Even the regulators are backing off. They are saying that we won't take action. How come the rating agencies failed with ILFS in this manner? Because somewhere that quasi-type government thing was lurking at the back. Whenever that is happening, in lieu of, so I think this is eminently possible. That will be only a first step. But then we have to run that system. Now whether that system will still be run with phone calls or not phone calls, we don't know. But at least that system will have a better chance. Because there will be pressure, because then there will be pressure on the regulators to regulate these PSUs just like as you regulate a bank. There will be pressure on the PSU. Now you perform like any other business entity. To the extent, there will be still ifs and buts and all that. I'm not saying that it will go away all of a sudden. There will be pressure on the board. You perform like a board. Otherwise, there are people sitting outside. You can be taken to court. You can be taken to. You can be sued. So there will be some sort of pressure. So first thing to do is for that one set of legal reform. Then push that administrative. Let it run. And of course then try and but I think how that runs will of course depend on who are the actors. That will include the management, what sort of people are put on the board as independent directors by the government, because at this stage I'm not even suggesting that goes along with the government. But at least some disclosures which currently, for example, now you don't have to disclose even what norms are there for appointment of directors. Now, why that should not be disclosed to the world, God knows. Why should PSUs have that exemption? But it is there. It's right up front. So some of this will take away. I'm not saying that by itself will not ensure that everything will run smoothly. But this is a necessary first step, and that is eminently doable. Eminently doable because you're not fighting against any union, you're not doing anything, you're not using our politics. You just have to make sure. Only thing is, right now I think there's some sense that there's better administrative control this way. What I'm arguing is that not necessarily better administrative control. This way everything is getting more lax. You'll be more efficient if you do it the other way. You have the regulatory system. The regulatory system itself needs reform, that's another story.
So I'm Devashish Bhattacharya. I'm a chartered accountant. I have some public sector experience as well. So my question is to Mr. Bose. Okay, once the exemptions are gone, does the restrictions also need to go away with that? Like in a public sector, you have CAG, you have CVC, all those things which are not with the private sector. Does it also go so that only the controllership remains with the government as a shareholder only, but complete freedom is also given? Then it is a level playing field.
See, CAG is not going to go away. CAG is not going to go away. Let's see. But these reform, what I am talking about, is also is doable even without doing away with CAG and CVC. That reform, as I'm saying, that CAG is something I don't think CAG itself is reforming itself. They have undergone, internally they are undergoing a whole lot of things, how they look upon commercial operations. That exercise is on. But I don't think Parliament will ever say that no, there will be no CAG control on PSUs. That's not possible. That's not within the realm of what is feasible. But this is quite feasible. CVC, no, it doesn't go away. But then how does CVC itself reform? If the CAG is reforming, they're putting in those lens of being commercial. CVC also has to take a realistic view.
Exactly.
I think that these institutions will have to take a realistic view.
I will just take the couple of questions which have come and which have been either partly answered or maybe a little more clarification could be given. Starting from Shubhamay first. You had a question, how does the commercial miner deal with railways and the consumers of coal, and whether, partly I think Mr. Perti had actually pointed out that we need to do that experiment, because unless we do that, as we give it up, then it is like child not being born. So that's, I think when you mentioned that, it was entered at this. You see, the railways have a fairly in-depth experience of moving, transporting materials across the country. They are dealing with imported coal. The imports are being done by IPPs coming from various places, and railways are delivering it. So railways are not necessarily wedded to Coal India. I won't say that. They have a different functionality. Maybe their capacities will have to be increased, but that can be dealt with. As far as the coal consumers are concerned, if they are in the commercial world, they would like to look at landed cost in rupees per Gcal. That's the only number they will look at. Whoever delivers that best gets the contract.
And consistently.
If it is, and consistently.
Consistently.
So consistency is one factor, and rupees per Gcal. That's the only thing they will look at. So I don't think on these accounts the commercial miner will have too much of a problem.
But before that, what Sumit said very important.
Yeah.
The regulatory system, once you...
Yeah, I'm assuming that those
that
things.
is done.
That should get done.
Done, this won't work.
Yeah, that should get done. That should get done. But even without that, the overall railways do.
That has to be done, then it can work.
Yeah. So the other thing is Mr. Rohagi's point about future of coal. See, last year BP published a report which covered 22 years from 1995 to 2017. Share of various energy, primary commercial energy in power generation. And I was quite sort of amused to see that the share of renewables and gas, there was an increase in both. And the increase was to the extent of 10%. Now that 10% didn't come from coal. That 10% came from oil and nuclear. So oil went down, nuclear went down. Coal was 38% in 1995, it is 38% in 2017. So that is one. Of course, I don't say the next 22 years is going to be the same, because in the last period we didn't see the solar tariff and renewable tariff coming down to this extent. So that will not be the situation. Coming to Vishnu Saab's, your point about the board, I must say here a particular incident. See, equally interesting, but not of that size. It was in one of the subsidiary companies, and we had by that time adopted Integrity Pact. This was, actually I spoke to the CVC and told him that too many complaints, and every complaint is addressed to, right from President of India up to Chairman Coal India, and all complaints come into the Chairman Coal India's table, he doesn't know what to do. So decisions don't get taken. So Mr. Pratyush's advice was, why didn't you go for adoption of Integrity Pact? And you can use Mr. Shuvir Raha as the resource person, because they have done it in ONGC. So we introduced it with all fanfare. That required that any complaint that comes, nobody can look at that first excepting the IAMs. There's an IAM named, he has to look at it first. So in one of the washery tenders, quite a big washery tender by Coal India standards, by subsidiary standards, in one of the subsidiary, I think the director from ministry who came, he received complaints. So he initially said that we should retender. There's a complaint. But the L1 was attractive, the LRMC, it was done through long range marginal costing, there's a process. And the CMD was very keen that this tender goes through. So coming out of the board meeting, he called me up, that this is what is being said. So what to do? And I remember I had called up Mr. Balakrishnan. He was the secretary at that time. So I said that if there is a complaint, the board cannot take a decision of rejecting or cancelling that tender. It should be referred to IAM. And board can go by the IAM's recommendation or can defer at that stage. So, but this is what is happening. In 10 minutes the problem was solved, because that gentleman got another call. This time from Mr. Balakrishnan. I don't know sir, whether you remember. But it happened. So this is a way to, you have to have institutional safeguards created. That's the only way.
The cabinet secretary, minister, they couldn't solve it.
No,
It came from
the point is, if there is an institutional IEM integrity pack there, the first point of call is the IEM, not the cabinet secretary.
And there was no complaint against the company for something else.
That is different. But if there is something wrong with the tender as such, no, then that's a different case. I'm comparing apples and oranges, so that is not the right thing to do. Coming to these FSAs being more balanced, I completely agree, Mr. Dasgupta. I mean, FSAs should have been more balanced, but unfortunately the problem is, when this, in 2009 particularly, I dealt with that issue, when the requirement of FSA and take or pay penalty clause, etc. was brought in, at that time, the theory was that we have to meet normative requirement of coal. And normative requirement for power sector was 90%. So if I add up 90% of normative requirement of the power sector, it is 1.5 times the production target that we have. So it's quite apparent that if I agree to that, right from day one, I'm going to start paying a lot of penalty. So my question was to the power sector, will penalty allow you to produce coal, generate power? If I give you kgs of rupees in borans, will that meet the equivalent of coal supply and allow you to generate power? There was no answer, honestly speaking. And I must say that I'm hugely grateful, thankful to Mr. Jayaraj, because he was once holding a meeting on the same subject where I represented from Coal India, and then there were CMD, NTPC, even Secretary Power. They said, this is the rule, government has framed the rule, I don't know how you give the coal, you have to give the coal, and things like that. So I said, sir, if I am producing, fortunately in Planning Commission there used to be 3 targets. One target was production of coal, 2 is overall dispatch, 3rd was dispatch to power plants. So I said, if I am dispatching the quantity that I am supposed to dispatch to power plants, how do I expect to pay penalty? So the best thing is, and that was used to be 306 in that particular year, I still remember the number. So you ask somebody in power sector, either CA or MOP or whatever it is, to distribute at 306. I will adopt that as ACQ. And if I am doing less than 90% of that number, I will be happily paying penalty. Mr. Jayaraj said yes, right, done. That is 2009. Later on what happened was, later on again this problem came up, sir, that you see the ACQs have to be determined in such a manner which is consistent with the target of coal supply to power stations, which is annually laid down by the Planning Commission or Niti Aayog, whatever it is. So if that convergence is there, then there is no problem. But if the convergence is not there, just because there is something written in some paper and power sector insists, you will have this kind of disbalanced FSS. That is actually the starting point of the FSS being like that.
But that is just one issue.
I know. So, you see, there are many others.
Plus,
I know
you've got NTPC versus state versus private.
Yeah,
a lot of
those
disparities. Disparities are there.
Some of these things came up later. Some of these things came up at that time. In fact, we had to actually put a legal team to work to frame the FSS in such a manner that we are not unduly hit. So that is PPAs were not fructify. The one point that Mr. Dasgupta, you mentioned that the PPAs that were signed may not fructify. Now, there is a question that I have. See, then are we not abandoning the sanctity of contract?
So we have done it so many times.
Is that the right thing to do? I mean, you see, then what? I'll tell you, I am a director in a company which went into developing wind power in a big way, and there was a lot of excitement. They were developing. They developed about 3 power stations, 110 megawatts, and then suddenly the state government said that no, the PPA price is too high. So before there was a dispute on that, from a buy-side investor, he became a sell-side investor.
No, but
Let's shut it off.
This is just the case. Like Coal India vis-a-vis power station, it's an inequitous balance of power.
Yeah, there again, state government and so on. Yeah.
It's a monopsony.
Yeah.
Monopsony.
Yes.
Now, so as a result, what happened was, people who were interested and keen to invest more, they would have developed maybe 500, 600 megawatt of power. Suddenly felt these 110, let us drop it like hot potato. They sold it off and exited the market. So this is what happens. So you are deprived of players.
So I think we are. Sorry.
I just wanted to react to this thing. You said during FSA. See, there was a real, I would say, very difficult crisis that was in the year 2011, because the production suddenly fell and there was a big gap. And that year, I think the whole industry, whoever, whether it was the CIA or everybody was there in power. Apart from the government companies, there was everybody. You can think in the business groups. And they had gone up to meet the finance minister, even the PM, and they were saying, okay, where is the coal? Why can't we give coal? What's happening? So I remember Mr. Khurana, who was the Ashok Khurana, he came and virtually started fighting with me, saying that you have to give coal, you see, less than 85% we can't service the debt. My PLF has to be 85. I said it has never reached that level in average. So where is the question? He says, no, new plants have to do it. So on the sideline I asked some of the PM, I said, what is the minimum that will help you to, with a little input, will be able to get you across? So they said 670 तक हमें मिल जाएगा तो शायद हम काम चला लें. And so I then got down into an exercise in which we looked at the production projections, and I remember sitting down with Mr. Jha and myself at the production in my room. We started calculating on the demand which Mr. P.K. Umashankar was putting on us, who was the power secretary. This is the amount of coal we need this year, this amount of coal next year, this amount. We said, fine, if my production goes as projected, we can give you X amount. And I clearly remember 2011-12, we pegged it at 65%. But I said, I told the CIL at that time that if your production goes as projected, then you have to give 83% in the terminal year of the plan period, that is 16-17. That is the projections of power that is given. Now, we took that decision at the ministry level. And there was some degree of, in fact, I remember sitting in the finance ministry, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee looked at me and says, why and where is there no coal? Why aren't you able to give it? I said, sir, we worked it out, we can give up to this much. He looked at the power secretary, he said, sir, even if we get that, it's fine. So we settled at that. But subsequently, the next 3 years, the damn thing remained at 65. It's only now that they have kind of committed to 75, and I'm not sure whether you're getting it.
No, 75 is what they're talking. The issue is that
The-
power pricing is on two principles, fixed and variable cost.
Yes.
So the issue is if he can't run the power plant to show at least he can run it at a availability of 85%, he doesn't recover his full fixed cost.
I agree.
So is that, but that's a forced outage. It's listed as a forced outage. Anyways, I think we'll.
This is. I'm just trying to tell you
yeah.
how the background was there. Yeah.
So I think we'll have to come back to that at refreshments. It's been an enthralling. My gosh, I will not even mention how long we've been discussing as dry and technical a topic as coal. So it just shows, the importance of this topic, the depth of knowledge of our distinguished panelists and their insights, and the audience as well. Thank you, everyone. And please join us for refreshments, and we can hopefully continue this conversation. Thank you.